Afternoon all. I'd like to take you this afternoon to the World Blitz Championship of 2009. Again, we played through the game Magnus Carlsen versus Morozevich earlier today, but this game against Vishy Anand is very, very interesting, with Magnus having the black pieces. So the time limit is just 3 minutes each with a 2-second increment. So Vishy started with d4, and we have d5 from Magnus, c4, and a queen's gambit declined. So very classical, knight c3, and now bishop e7, trying to discourage bishop g5. So sometimes the bishop goes to f4 in this variation. We see Vishy taking on d5, and after ed, we indeed see bishop f4 now. Knight f6, e3. And you might think this next move is a little bit risky. It really depends on the exact position, whether it's playable or not. We see bishop f5. Even though it leaves b7 behind, it's not entirely critical here. It's one of actually, in this particular position, this is actually one of the most played moves, the second most popular move, bishop f5. If you think it's exploitable with queen b3, because that looks as though it's awkward, well, there is a continuation, for example, like this, queen b3, knight c6, the knight's ready to go to b4 here, queen takes b7, knight b4. The king, after bishop b5 check, can go to f8, and it's pretty sharp stuff, but let's not get into that. So bishop f5 is playable, and Vishy plays h3. Now, Magnus plays c6, after knight f3, knight bd7, and now a very aggressive move, g4. Does this have downsides to play g4 here? How easy are they to exploit? Well, Magnus actually puts his bishop on e4 here, pinning the knight to the rook. Let's put on a Blitz just to see what's going on here. I think bishop g6 looks as though that's playable as well. So bishop e4 is good as well. Bishop g2 was played here. Tempting is just to take on e4 as well, but this might be okay for black. After knight takes e4, it's okay. So bishop g2, now both sides castle, rook e8, and now indeed knight takes e4, knight takes e4, knight d2, we have an exchange on d2, and after knight f8, the interesting thing for me about this game is that we see a classic minority attack now being witnessed. So the minority attack is the minority of pawns here attacking a majority of pawns with the intention of trying to cause structural damage. For example, taking here would result in an isolated A pawn and a backward C pawn. So going from a solid pawn structure to a very weakened one with two major structural weaknesses is White's usual plan. But there is a downside to the minority attack, and I think even though this is a blitz game, this is a very, very interesting example of what the downside is. It's in terms of time and king safety. If black can react on the king side, often he or she can balance this minority attack plan. And what we see here is play directly on both sides of the board. So we see b4, not bothering to move a rook. It has to be played quickly and swiftly. The queen does support b4 here, and it looks as though b5 is an immediate positional threat. Now black reacts with knight g6, and it looks as though this can't be tolerated. Knight takes f4. Let's quickly check this. b5, knight takes f4. This is too much structural damage for white here. After bishop d6, it's not that pleasant here. Black's got numerous threats like queen f6. So white has to react to that knight g6, and puts the bishop for a moment suspending the minority attack on g3. Now Magnus plays bishop d6, again threatening structural damage to double the pawns here. This is taken, queen takes d6, and now here it looks as though, is there finally time to play b5 in this position? Possibly even as a pawn sacrifice. In fact, it's the engine's top recommendation just to do it as a pawn sacrifice, because even as a pawn sacrifice, d5 is slightly weakened and we get a position with immediate pressure on black's queen side like this. But this wasn't played. In fact, Vishy prepares b5 without using a pawn sack. He just plays rook ab1. So how quick is this minority attack compared to black's kingside attack intentions? Magnus actually plays a move which I think is worthy of note when handling the defensive side of minority attacks. He played actually a6. The idea is, well, at least black won't be left with an isolated a pawn once the structural damage occurs. It will just be a backward c pawn, so that's one less structural weakness to worry about. But also the rook, which hasn't moved on a8, is actually quite useful in its starting square, just to go down the a file if opportunity arises later. But white carries on playing through with this b5 intention, and now we see another. The downside is black's given a bit of time here to play an aggressive move to try and weaken white's king safety. Magnus plays knight h4, and the queen here is not only supporting the backward pawn for a moment, the potentially backward pawn, but it also can swing to the king side. So is there going to be a major king side assault here? Well, b5 is played, and Magnus takes. After takes, we see it's only going to be a backward c pawn. That's one thing to lessen the damage here, and the rook is active on the a file. We see now queen g6. So here finally part of the structural damage benefits have been received from white, this backward pawn on the c file. On the other hand, there's no backward a pawn, and this rook's going down that file, which some authors have sometimes questioned in similar analysis positions, as though it might be not that useful. But it's a theoretical activity which could be useful, especially if the rook has intentions later to coordinate for some sort of kingside attack if black gets going on the king side here. We see rook fc1 targeting the backward pawn. And now h5. What does white want to do here? And you might also think, well, what if white wanted to preserve his bishop as well? If he had moved his bishop instead of rook fc1, what if bishop h1? Was that too slow, you might ask? On bishop h1, h5 is actually quite dangerous. Let's see. If f3, in this position, it looks as though rook a3 is a very useful resource on e3 here. And we see also, I think the queen eyeing b1 is very useful for deflecting that rook like this tactically. So we see this is very, very unpleasant, this kind of tactical idea. So the queen's not only targeting the king side, it's putting useful pressure on b1 here, as you can see tactically. So the minority attack has given a bit of activity to black, which needs to be factored in here. So white's idea, if bishop h1 was an idea, it has to be ruled out here. It doesn't look that pleasant. So we see actually instead, if we go back to the position, rook fc1, h5. So Magnus is getting on with his kingside attack intentions. He's got this backward pawn, and that's what I find very, very interesting about this game. He's playing on the attacking side where he has clear structural damage in terms of that backward c pawn, but he's getting a raging kingside attack potentially. We see the move queen c2, threatening to take off queens and also just exploit c6. Magnus gives up now c6 with queen g5, and it has to be very well calculated here. Move like f4 leaves with it a weakness on e3. Black could play either queen e7 or queen h6, and apparently this is okay for black. For example, like this, hg, and black apparently is okay. Even there's a continual nag here for piece activity. If, for example, taking here, queen takes c6, there's always queen takes e3. So it's not that easy to exploit that backward pawn at the moment. So actually f4 was avoided. White's trying to keep this structure intact for a moment and just plays queen takes c6, but it looks as though, hold on, this hg isn't that dangerous, or knight takes g2 first. Magnus actually plays knight takes g2 first. It's important because otherwise actually bishop d5, surely, if hg or queen takes d5 even. So the bishop has to be taken off here. We see knight takes g2 and only now hg. So black has kept his material equality even after this minority attack has occurred. Now we see h4 trying to deflect the queen away from d5. If queen takes h4, we'd actually first have to flick in rook h1 though to avoid any queen h3s. After queen g5, In fact, here now the queen protecting rook b5 shows that this d pawn is a bit vulnerable. And in fact, white's going to use a tactic for overloading here on e8 potentially. So if rook ed8, queen c7, this is still actually this is still quite okay for black, but there's some other tactical threats like queen h2 based on this h file. So actually Magnus, he didn't go in for this. Actually he didn't want to give white's h file attack any impetus here. He just plays queen f5. It's simpler continuation, and it's actually in favor of black technically. Now we see queen d6, which is actually making the position a lot worse. I think white had to play something apparently like rook f1 to help defend the king side, but we see after queen d6 a really vicious attack continuation from Magnus Carlsen. So having survived this minority attack, he's now well onto the attack with queen f3 check, and now rook a2. Vishy's really under fire here on his king side. He defends now f2, but now can you see what Magnus played? It's a really crushing move. If I give you 10 seconds starting from now, what would you play as black? Okay, rook takes e3. This rook on the 7th, which was a side effect of white's minority attack, it seems to have really backfired. This rook activity and this king side attack is really dangerous now. If takes, we just mate on g2 here. Queen g2 is mate. So Vishy tries queen d8 check. After king h7, queen g5. It looks as though this check here is quite dangerous. That stopped with g3, eyeing h5, and now threatening g takes as well and other stuff. We see here that the rook can be taken though. It is taken. Is that white's best? It's probably one of white's best moves in the circumstance. If queen takes g3, then Magnus could take here on g3, take here, and actually you could consider now playing f6 with the threat now of rook h3 check to win h4, and that's quite pleasant for black. So Vishy tried queen takes e3 to get 2 rooks for the queen, but here, so after g takes, black is winning the queen now, so the queen has to take. Magnus throws in, he doesn't throw in a check, although that's very, very interesting. It could be an important nuance actually, at least from an engine point of view, to throw in the check here, but Magnus just takes on f2 immediately. He's still better after check, queen takes d4 check. It's much easier to manage the queen, especially in a blitz game, rather than 2 rooks, especially if the queen can have support extra from these pawns marching down. And the pawns do start marching down, and black's advantage starts getting more clear cut here, especially after this d3 move. So offering f5 here, if this is taken, if rook takes f5, then we have check, and it just shows the lack of coordination of the rooks. I think we can just play potentially just d2 here is a very, very strong move. And the rooks are overloaded. If rook d5, we've got queen e4 check. So it shows the queen's really working well with the pawns now at this stage after d3. We see h5, check, rook g2, check, king h1, now d2, rook gg1, f4. The pawns are really working well with the queen. King g2, queen e3. After rook h1, we see splat, queen g3 mate. Now I've played through this game actually a number of times. I was going to present it in the past, but actually I must admit today it seemed to be more attractive the more I looked at this game, because it demonstrated what would you consider a clear-cut classical strategic plan in this game of the minority attack at work. But we see a very practical downside of this whole intention to damage the structure, that black first of all minimises the structural damage. He's going to use the A file and not going to be left with a bad isolated A pawn. And we see the time that Magnus used for the king side attack. I think it was quite an instructive game, and I hope that you do too. I thought it was very, very instructive and shows Magnus Carlsen as the aggressor here, going for the kingside attack. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.